Today, we're diving into a truly pivotal moment in history, one that really foreshadowed the horrors to come, Kristallnacht. You've probably heard of it as the Night of Broken Glass. But the shattered windows were just the surface. We're going beyond the headlines using an episode of the Rest is History podcast as our guide to understand how the Nazis went from hosting the Olympics in '36 to orchestrating this wave of violence just 2 years later.
Yeah, and what's so striking about this period is how the Nazis used such a calculated escalation of persecution. It wasn't a sudden explosion, right, of violence. It was a carefully constructed campaign rooted deep within their ideology.
Yeah, it's so easy to, simplify history and be like, well, the Nazis were evil. But this deep dive reveals a far more complex story, one where ideology intertwined with economic factors and individual acts of both cruelty and resistance.
Right. The podcast does a great job of dissecting this complexity. One of the key questions they raise is how the Nazis could go from presenting a somewhat tolerant face to the world during the 1936 Olympics to unleashing the brutality of Kristallnacht just 24 months later. It's wild.
Yeah, because even during the Olympics, Hitler's hatred of Jews was no secret. Mein Kampf was readily available, laying out his hateful ideology. So what shifted in those 2 years?
Well, the podcast argues that while the Nazis were certainly focused on showcasing a cleaned-up Germany to the world during the Olympics, right, they really had a larger agenda at play. They desired war and expansion, and they saw Jews as an internal enemy that needed to be neutralized before they could pursue those goals of conquest.
And this wasn't just like a general dislike. They went so far as to view Jewish people as a disease, a virus infecting the German body politic.
Exactly. That medical metaphor was incredibly powerful. It allowed the Nazis to frame their increasingly radical solutions as like necessary treatments to rid Germany of a supposed sickness. One of the most chilling examples of this twisted thinking is the Madagascar Plan. Did you know about this?
Yeah, the Madagascar Plan, they actually contemplated shipping all of Germany's Jewish citizens to this island off the coast of Africa. I mean, it sounds completely absurd.
It does sound absurd, but when you connect it to the bigger picture of Nazi ideology, it reveals the deeply genocidal undercurrents already present in their thinking. It wasn't about finding a safe haven for Jews. It was about isolating them, removing them from what the Nazis saw as, like, their territory.
And here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The podcast highlights how this persecution wasn't solely driven by ideology. Cold, hard greed played a significant role as well. Many prominent German businesses, some of which are still household names today, profited immensely from the Aryanization of Jewish-owned businesses.
Yeah. Aryanization, for those unfamiliar, was the forced transfer of Jewish-owned businesses to, quote, Aryan Germans, often for a fraction of their actual value. So companies like Allianz, Krupp, Siemens, they all participated in this legalized theft. It's a truly disturbing example of how economic incentive systems can be intertwined with persecution, making collaboration both profitable and, sadly, socially acceptable.
It's chilling to think about the enthusiasm with which many ordinary Germans participated in Kristallnacht. It wasn't just the SS or the Gestapo carrying out the violence. Everyday citizens were smashing windows, looting shops, terrorizing their Jewish neighbors.
Yeah.
How did the Nazi regime cultivate this level of hatred and violence within their own populace?
Yeah, that's a critical question the podcast explores. And they point to the immense power of propaganda, the relentless drumbeat of anti-Semitic rhetoric that painted Jews as like the scapegoat for all of Germany's problems.
Yeah, and they also talk about how the Nazis manipulated a narrative, framing their actions as an expression of the people's will, like a spontaneous outpouring of anger. But, as the podcast reveals, Kristallnacht was meticulously planned. A carefully orchestrated pogrom directed from the highest levels of the Nazi government.
Totally. One specific event that the podcast examines in detail is the assassination of Ernst vom Rath, a German diplomat in Paris, by Herschel Greenspan, a young Jewish man driven to desperation by the deportation of his family from Germany.
Right. The assassination was condemned by many Jewish leaders, but the Nazis seized upon it as the pretext for unleashing Kristallnacht. They used this tragic act to justify the violence they had already planned.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2 of our deep dive. We'll dissect the anatomy of Kristallnacht itself, exploring the coordinated violence, the destruction of synagogues and businesses, the mass arrests, and the terrifying ease with which the veneer of civilization was stripped away. Picking up where we left off, it's important to consider how the rest of the world reacted to this meticulously planned pogrom. Like, what was the fallout?
Yeah, you'd think such a blatant act of violence would have been a wake-up call for everybody. Did Kristallnacht change the international community's perception of Nazi Germany? Did it make people realize, oh, this is serious?
Well, sadly, the response was largely muted. While there was some condemnation, the podcast points out that the seeds of appeasement were still deeply rooted. Many world leaders were hesitant to confront Hitler directly, fearing another devastating war. I mean, understandable, right?
You can really sense the frustration in the podcast hosts' voices as they're discussing this. Like, they highlight how even after witnessing such a horrific event, few could have truly grasped the scale of the systematic, industrialized genocide that was to come. It's mind-blowing.
It really is. And that speaks to the insidious nature of evil, how it often unfolds incrementally. The Nazis didn't simply wake up one day and decide to exterminate the Jewish people. It was a gradual process, a series of escalating steps that, over time, desensitized people to the growing horror.
So it started with like hateful rhetoric, then discriminatory laws, then economic exclusion, culminating in the eruption of violence we see in Kristallnacht, right?
Exactly. And at each stage, there were opportunities to intervene, to say enough. But too often, the world remains silent, either out of fear or, worse, apathy.
Right. Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that ignoring warning signs, dismissing hateful rhetoric as just talk, can have devastating consequences. And it makes you think about how the story of Herschel Greenspan, the young man who assassinated the German diplomat, right? How does that fit into this larger picture?
That's a really fascinating point. Greenspan became a symbol of Jewish desperation and resistance. He was driven to a desperate act after his family was deported from Germany. And while his actions were condemned by many Jewish leaders, the podcast makes it clear that the Nazis had already been planning a large-scale act of violence against Jews.
Oh, wow. So he was trying to bring attention to the plight of his people, but the Nazis used his actions to further their own agenda, it sounds like.
Precisely. They twisted the narrative, portraying Greenspan as a dangerous aggressor, a representative of the entire Jewish population, to justify the violence they were already prepared to unleash. They had it ready to go.
That manipulation of the narrative is something that really struck me. It makes you think about the power of propaganda, how it can so effectively distort people's perceptions of reality. It's crazy.
Absolutely. We see this same dynamic at play throughout history, and even today, with the rise of misinformation and echo chambers online, it's more important than ever to be aware of it.
Yeah, for sure. It's a stark reminder that we have to be critical consumers of information, always questioning the narratives we're being fed, especially when they target and demonize entire groups of people. Like, don't just take things at face value.
And that brings us to, I think, a crucial takeaway from this deep dive. Understanding how propaganda works. The Nazis were masters at manipulating emotions, twisting facts, and using scapegoating to consolidate their power. Like, that's their playbook.
Yeah, and the podcast really drives home the point that Kristallnacht wasn't just about broken glass. It was about broken lives, broken families, and a world that allowed this to happen. That's the real tragedy.
Yeah. And as we grapple with this dark chapter in history, I think the podcast leaves us with a really sobering question. What can we learn from this? What lessons can we apply to our own lives, to the world we live in today? What can we take away from all this?
Yeah, it's heavy stuff, no doubt. But I think you're right. The podcast makes a really powerful point about, confronting these uncomfortable truths. Like burying our heads in the sand doesn't make the darkness go away.
Totally, yeah. Understanding the complexities, the economic factors, the creeping in of hate, the ways in which ordinary people can become complicit, all of that is crucial if we want to, truly learn from history. Like, we can't just brush it under the rug.
Yeah, and one thing that really stuck with me from this episode was the point about the Nazis framing their actions as like the will of the people,
Yeah.
It's frightening how easily populism can be manipulated to justify the unthinkable. It's like, whoa.
Yeah, and it underscores the vital importance of critical thinking, right? We can't just passively accept everything those in power tell us. We have a responsibility to question motives, to examine the evidence, and to resist attempts to scapegoat and demonize entire groups of people. Like, we have to be vigilant.
For sure, for sure. Well, the podcast ends with a call to action, urging listeners to kind of delve deeper into this period of history. They suggest reading firsthand accounts from survivors.
Yeah.
And educating ourselves about the warning signs of genocide, like being proactive, right?
Right. And they remind us that knowledge is our most potent weapon against the recurrence of such horrors. It's up to each of us to ensure that never again truly means never again. It's a powerful message.
Yeah, it is. And I think as we reflect on this chilling story of Kristallnacht, it's worth asking ourselves, What seemingly small acts of discrimination or prejudice do we see happening around us today? And what can we do in our own lives to challenge those injustices and prevent history from repeating itself?
Mhm.
What can we actually do?
It's a question we should all be asking ourselves, because the road to Kristallnacht and to all the horrors that followed was paved with indifference and inaction, and we have the power to choose a different path.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive into Kristallnacht. It's been sobering, but incredibly important, to really unpack these events and think about how they resonate even today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.